It's budget day on the Isle of Man and Manx.News have gathered three ministers, and a panel to talk about the budget. Good evening and welcome to this Manx.News special budget analysis. Today, the Isle of Man Government unveiled a £1.47 billion spending plan for the year ahead. A budget framed around stability, investment and easing pressure on households. We've got a full hour analysis, reaction and debate, and a panel that can take us right to the heart of the decisions made today. Joining me, we have the Chief Minister Alfred Cannan, we have the Treasury Minister Chris Thomas, we have Leader of Douglas Council Devon, we have a representative from Construction Isle of Man, Brian Butler, and we have a representative from the Isle of Man Chamber of Commerce, Chris Corlett. We're going to break down the tax changes, the big spending commitments, the capital programme, and what this budget really means for household and employers across the island. Thank you both for joining me today.
Pleasure.
So Chris, could you give us a little overview of what the budget entails?
So £1.5 billion of spending, nearly £100 million extra spending. We haven't had a problem in government with spending money over the last 4 years. What we have had a problem over is getting the income to match that. So income's been growing, and expenditure's been greater than the income. And we need to tackle that because it's been affecting our reserves and it's a structural deficit that we've got to overcome. And what we've done this year is we've increased the personal tax allowance, unveiled new things like the global Pillar 2 tax amount that's going to come to the island from now and in future years. And basically we're talking about a budget of confidence so that we can have stable and secure public services financed with stable and secure public finances, and that the big picture is what the budget is all about.
Now, Chief Minister, you've spoken before about long-term financial discipline. Does this budget deliver that? And how do you measure success, given you don't have 12 months to do so? We only have 6 months until the House of Keys dissolves in August.
No, look, and this was the final budget of this administration. It hasn't been an easy 5 years. There's been a lot of pressure, particularly from the healthcare budget. We recognise that. We've seen that pressure. We've set out to try and facilitate budgeting for healthcare that meets the needs, that enables services to continue to be delivered. But there's no question, a challenge remains. I think what I set out in my budget speech today is that I hope we have at least provided a platform for the next administration to get to work quickly in terms of assessing the way that it wants to go forward. And there are a number of mechanisms to enable it to do that. One, of course, through the budget that's been delivered today, but I think also with the creation of the Operations Performance and Change Board, which is right at the centre of government, that itself will, and indeed the Treasury Ministers now coming on board to join me in terms of bringing forward further efficiencies across government. I think that will help provide a greater platform. And I hope that the next government will take the opportunity to really drive a finance-based change programme rather than perhaps start in terms of drawing up a wish list. And I'd much rather see a hard-nosed approach. And I think that has been drawn out from quite a lot of commentary we've received around the budget today, one or two of the reports that we've been receiving. I think everybody recognises that although we have set out actually a considered programme in the Treasury Minister's budget that does take us to net surplus, that does start to put money back into reserves at the end of the latest 5-year period. Evidence would suggest that road is difficult, is tricky, and that actually the government will need to work harder in terms of its streamlining, I think, if it's really to achieve success. But the other thing that I wanted to highlight, and I think Chris Thomas did a good job today, was really sort of painting the picture around this as well. I mean, absolutely, we've got to think about our current service delivery, and getting that streamlined. But we've also got other themes that are surrounding this, the potential for energy revenues if we can deliver on that in the next 5 years. The Pillar 2 additional revenues that are coming in, I think we need to treat that cautiously, but we have got additional revenues coming in that area. So, and of course, we need to make sure that we are delivering on essentials. And I know you've got Brian Butler here from the construction forum, but in the construction industry. But we've also got to make sure that we are delivering a capital programme that both works for government, but also works for the private sector as well. And those are the sorts of themes I think that were set out in the budget today, alongside the facts and figures.
Now, Treasury Minister, do you believe that the efficiency targets are realistic?
Yes. So I focused on the healthcare programme, which has got an extra element to it. It's got a cost improvement programme. It's also got a transformation programme, a funded transformation programme, and essentially we laid down a line in the sand today, which I'm sure the Minister and her team will do absolutely everything to stay the right side of. So in other words, we couldn't afford to give them everything they asked for, and they've accepted that, and they've come back, and we're having intense, difficult discussions about the transformation and about how it will work and what will happen through the next 6 months. Because I didn't hide it from, as suggested by Mr. Hooper, but it hasn't gone completely according to plan this last year. So at some point there will be a Tynwald vote for this last year. We're in a difficult situation for healthcare, and but we need to find efficiencies as well. I joined the healthcare department myself back in October 2024. The Chief Minister wanted me, the council ministers at the time collectively didn't want me in healthcare, and it was important for both of us then that we had to draw a line in the sand, and we've done that now, and we're working with the healthcare Minister and with everybody else and around the team. We'll find efficiencies, and we'll have the health service we deserve and we need. Away from that, the issue of, say for instance, shared services came up with healthcare, and it's good for an example. We've had a generalised minibus fleet and a generalised ambulance fleet. We've made improvements to the ambulance fleet in today's budget. We've enabled it financially, and we are having intense discussions between healthcare and Treasury and other parts of government about how we're going to end up with a non-essential patient transfer service that meets the right standards for the people who really need higher standards, but not so high for those who don't need so high standards, and works better for the public purse and consequently the Isle of Man. So those are the sorts of things we're doing, which are all effectively, you could call them efficiencies, because they're about the productivity of the healthcare system delivering what we need throughout this island.
Now, obviously the most, I suppose, spoken about and most anticipated part of this budget was the rise in the thresholds. Yeah. We've obviously seen a really big lift in those, which will hopefully lift 3,600 people.
Not quite as much as you wanted.
Not quite, but I'll settle for it. Which will hopefully lift 3,600 people out of paying tax altogether, and we've seen a rise in the national insurance thresholds too. How confident are you that these changes will make a meaningful impact to families and workers?
Well, they will. Chief Minister did something similar, not quite to the same extent, although he claims it was in percentage terms, but he did something similar back in 2016-17 and took 3,000 people out of the tax net. And many of those people have been dragged into the tax net again since then, and we took them back, many of them back out again of the tax net. Not only did we that, we looked at for everybody. We looked at those in the middle, not quite everybody, because tax cappers and people who have their personal allowance taken away from the community don't benefit from this budget, but a whole wide range of people, and that should stimulate economic activity. The Chief Minister made a passionate and accurate speech about how it will stimulate economic activity, and he quoted figures from the experience 2017, 2018, 2019, dismissing naysayers and reminding some people, at least one person who eventually voted against this as a concept, that they applauded it back in 2017-19, so it must be some other factor rather than evidence that was making up their minds.
And I'd just like to go to Chris. This will obviously be a topic that will be of great interest to you from a business perspective. Do these tax and NI changes give employers the stability they need, or is this a budget that helps workers more than businesses?
I think it helps both. I think when looking at any budget, you have to look at a context. And the economic context is challenging. If you look at our recent national income statistics, we've seen significant contractions in key sectors. Not due to anything the Isle of Man has done wrong, but the world is changing. We've seen significant job losses in key sectors, financial services and e-gaming. And in that economic context, a government needs to act accordingly. So we do need economic stimulus in the short term. We also need a long-term strategic growth plan that the government and the private sector jointly work on. That will take time. So in the short term, government needed to act. And in doing so, by raising the allowances as they have, that will lead to tangible rises in real terms earnings for many lower to middle income families. And those people, as we've seen in historic analysis, as the Chief Minister rightly said, tend to spend their money in local businesses. So that will directly benefit local businesses too.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to note, tomorrow, I mean, the minimum wage, we will ask Tynwald to support effectively a 5% rise again in the minimum wage. So, employers are being asked to shoulder again, a fairly substantial burden, I would suggest. And I think, Charlie, to go to the point, and I do want to make this point, look, it has been a tricky 5 years. Bear in mind, we came into this government effectively on the back of significant outlay, significant expenditure from reserves, to support the economy, both individuals and businesses, hundreds of millions of pounds of outflow, and we came into, having to get everybody back to work in reasonable shape, but also perhaps to face some of the spikes then in the inflation and healthcare costs and all the rest of it. So I don't want to detract, from the difficulties that were faced by the government in those early years. But nevertheless, eventually we had to make a correction. And, I know this is sort of being portrayed as an election budget by its detractors, but fundamentally we had to. If we had gone on and imposed that almost 10% rise in employment costs for employers, in the current marketplace where so many people are now being squeezed, and bear in mind, as a government, we'd also put up taxes. I think the consequences would have been quite severe. And so therefore the change was absolutely necessary. It was the right change. It had to be made. It's not the be all and end all. Absolutely, it's not. But I think in making the change that I did, perhaps more of a substitution is probably the right word. But I think I did congratulate the Treasury Minister today, Chris Thomas, because it was brave of him to go along and say, actually, I concur. We're going to go for the best rise that I can possibly realistically bring forward in this budget. It was the right thing to do. There's a huge amount still to do when you look at an economy, a domestic economy that's still under pressure. And I think the other side of the coin is that looking across the water at what is going on, and a lot of the employment costs that are being attributed one way or another to the significant rise in youth unemployment. I think we do need to be fully aware and not take for granted, that our economy can change and change very, very quickly. So,
Yes.
For all those reasons, I think it was the right thing to do. It's not the be all and end all, absolutely.
If I can just comment on that.
I just want to push back briefly on the idea that paying your workers is a burden. I mean, at the end of the day, the workers and the employees are the people who create most of the value in the economy. And yes, business owners allocate capital toward certain projects, but at the same time, you can't innovate if you've got a low-wage economy, and we can't build our way out of poverty. We've got that bottom sixth of our population who do live in poverty, and I do a lot of work on weekends, particularly with constituents, and there's a man who lives not too far away from me, and he lives in absolute squalor because he's crushed between these twin burdens of extremely high private sector rent and extremely low wages, and his daughter doesn't have a bedroom to sleep in. She sleeps on the couch. And recently we've managed to get her a home in social housing. And one thing I do want to say is I do want to thank our partnership with government in helping deliver some of these new additional social housing units. But it's one of those where I think there's just a paradigm that we want to challenge here, in the idea that your workers are a burden that you somehow have to find a way to pay, and rather than these are assets, these are people who are worth investing in, because when we cut down on wage costs, we also cut down, as you say, on that economic stimulus that goes right back into the economy. There is no wealthy, successful, a productive economy that has a permanent underclass of people who can barely make ends meet. And that's where you get a lot of those additional problems, because when people live in desperate poverty, they have a lot of additional costs on Manx care. They have a lot of additional costs on addiction services. They end up in more likely to have run-ins with the criminal justice system. So I think that we just need to be very careful of a system whereby by saving money on wages, so to speak, we end up in a state where we end up costing public services a lot more over the long term.
If I can just, I don't think anybody in this room would argue, we don't want a low-wage economy. We don't want a low-wage economy. We want a strong economy giving good jobs and good wages to people. But there is an economic context. I mean, the minimum wage was introduced in 2001. In almost every year, it's risen materially faster than inflation. So every year in real terms, it's gone up significantly faster. 2020 to 25, it went up by nearly double the rate of inflation. And it's risen to the point at which it is a significant burden on certain businesses. And back to the economic context I talked about, we have a lot of businesses concentrated in certain sectors, retail and hospitality, who have been hurting through other cost rises and loss of revenues for a wide range of economic reasons. And now is not the time for yet another large minimum wage rise. Yes, continue to rise it, and it is a real terms rise. It is another real terms rise above the rate of inflation, and it is an important part of helping those at the lower end of the income scale, but it has to be done carefully and in a context. So I applaud what the government has done. I think it's the right balance. If there's a balance between the economy and protecting the most vulnerable in our community, and I think this is the right balance.
I think one of the questions I'd like to pose, and particularly pose on behalf of the Manx Labour Party, is because one thing I'd like to say is we applaud the increase in the tax threshold. Putting more money into people's pockets is great. It's just about the concerns around targeting, right? And both with this discussion around the minimum wage and with the discussion about this, that is the core concern, is that concern around targeting, right? Because yes, a lot of businesses do struggle. So our proposal was that you channel support to those businesses that are struggling. But there's a lot of businesses that are not struggling, and then they pay their workers less than a living wage. And essentially what the Treasury is doing is by paying out benefits to businesses who have full-time workers living in poverty. Essentially, as taxpayers, we end up subsidizing businesses that are doing very, very well for themselves, people who are not struggling by any means, and then these businesses end up outcompeting local small businesses, and a lot of those profits go straight back to the UK. So I think we have to ask ourselves that A, not all businesses are a monolith, and B, not all businesses have interests aligned with those of the Isle of Man.
Devon, I think probably we won't, judging from the arguments that have gone on today, and we probably won't agree on some of the fundamentals. But look, the point you make is right in the sense that actually, we must do everything that we can, and I think all my colleagues will want to do things that we can for the lowest paid in society, and to try and give everybody an opportunity. But also, I guess you would argue that the health of the economy is also fundamental to those individuals getting that opportunity. I think it is a question of absolutely balance, but I think fundamentally, we also have to remember that, it's not just the low paid sort of in the bracket of finding life tough at the moment. There's been a whole host of people right across the income stream, through the middle income brackets as well, where costs have risen significantly for them for a huge number of reasons. And I don't think there are perfect answers. I think governments do have to keep working, in a number of areas, and sometimes things flare up, and you probably find that one problem you've solved in one area and there's another issue in another area. I don't think we will sort of agree that divide, but I think we got our argument, and I think we did win the day on this. And I say thank you to the Treasury Minister for having the bravery to come forward. Was that actually the economy that people needed that lived right across the spectrum, and this wasn't just about one single element of our society. But Chris, sorry,
No.
I think it's good to see the related measures of seeing the extra 4.4 million for helping in relation to childcare, in relation to vocational training, in relationship to apprenticeships. I think that will definitely help many of the people Devon's talking about, to help people who are struggling to make ends meet and afford childcare, for example, and get the skills that they need. So I think that's very welcome too.
Treasury Minister, what do you have to say?
Well, I'm going to applaud Devon as leader of the council for the meeting we had, where I formed the impression that Devon was going to be very pragmatic in dealing with some of the issues that he dealt with. I mean, today he comes across, like he does sometimes, as having an ideological basis to his belief, and there's nothing wrong with that. But also, at the end of the day, together we want to solve the problems that he's identified. And there are two such that I want to focus on. The first one is housing, because Douglas City Council has to be in a position to help us solve the housing problem in Douglas, and if Douglas does it well, it'll be done well throughout the island, because Douglas is the most important, most significant housing provider. And so therefore, as Devon pointed out to me when we met, they have substantial amount of equity in their homes. They also have Lord Street, which needs something done with it, because people have moved out and into new houses that you built very, very reasonably priced with your new Peel Road development. So I hope that pragmatically, Treasury and the Isle of Man government through Treasury can work very well with the City Council to deal with the housing issue in our capital and beyond. So on that basis, one of the things that the Brownfield Regeneration Re-steering Group, which I hinted at in the meeting, and now it's public, as I told people in the debate today, is we've launched a review of development viability in our brownfield sites in the light of the higher construction costs that are absolutely there, and in the light of the way that procurement might impact on construction. And I want to work pragmatically with the council, so it would be very disappointing for me if the council don't provide, as part of the consultancy process, the evidence that they've excellently collected from developers, because they publicly invited offers for sites and for projects around that, and they can help us solve the issue of development viability. And in terms of the Labour Party problem, I did form the impression today. Well, no, in terms of the problem for the Labour Party, because it's your problem, because you own the problem. I did form the impression today that your members in the House of Keys were against a universal personal tax allowance rise.
Not at all. So that is not really the position as much. It's not to say that, hey, listen, we've been calling for a long time to see personal thresholds rise. We want to see a lot more people take home pay. But in terms of a targeted approach, right? So that man I was talking about earlier on, the person who lives in poverty, or a mother who works 16 hours a week because this is all she can get. Many hospitality businesses, as you know, don't offer 40 hours a week, right? Because this is just not their business model. This is not how they're structured. Yeah. So everyone who falls beneath that point, they don't receive any benefit whatsoever. And I think that if you are someone who struggles in poverty and can't quite hit that threshold, and you aren't benefiting from this budget, and you're seeing someone who makes £80,000-90,000 a year get that tax cut, when that funding could have been used on targeted services that could have made your position better, then you're going to feel a bit of concern, right? And yes, I do speak on behalf of the council at times, but I'd also like to speak on behalf of the fact that Douglas is a place where a lot of poverty is concentrated, and I'm really keen to take that pragmatic approach. But I think that particularly for this type of event, it's important to sometimes have that other side of the barrel.
Mm-hmm.
Now, going to a local government perspective, Devon, we're going to touch on housing, as Chris mentioned. Obviously, we've seen an uplift in the housing from the budget. How do you feel about that from a Douglas Council perspective?
Absolutely excellent. And this is one of the things that we're really, really grateful for out of our relationship with Treasury. And that's been brilliant, both with this minister and the previous minister, is that there has been that really constructive relationship to try and meet with us and engage. It's often felt like at times that I go out and I work in situations where people live in poverty, or during an allocation meeting, you have to make a choice between a woman who is fleeing domestic violence or a homeless man with a child, and who do you give a house to? And it's horrifying that for the cost of what could be £10,000 here or there, that a choice gets made that one of these people isn't going to win out. And I think it's one of those things where the scale of the problem, it's often felt like government doesn't really have that same concern. And I think it's one of those things that we're grateful to see a lot of the development, both in the private sector, because that'll bring jobs, that'll bring that value. But I think one of the things that we'd be concerned about is the fact that the subsidy going toward private sector luxury developments is, to a large extent, 2-3 times as high as the subsidy going toward providing essential public housing that people need. And if we were to poll the average person in the street and say, hey, listen, would you rather your subsidy going toward giving a multimillionaire another car, or sort of making their profitability just that little bit higher, or would you want to make sure that woman fleeing domestic violence has a place to go? I know which way they would choose on that one. And obviously that's a big part of pragmatism, is seeing who needs help and targeting your help toward those folks.
But those funds are made available to regenerate areas that wouldn't be able to be regenerated, which aren't viable, to allow housing, to allow developments to be undertaken, which brings the money back into the economy straight away. I mean, we had a meeting last week, and part of that was the money doesn't come until the end. Government gets the money back before they spend it. Because of the money that goes into the economy and comes back through government again. They get the money back before they even spend it on the IIS.
I
agree with you what you're saying.
Yeah.
Of course, if you go along and you say to somebody, who do you want the money to go? Do you want the money to go to the multimillionaire who may not be a multimillionaire, might just be somebody who's got a bit of development land that wants to develop? Or do you want it to go to a homeless woman? Everybody's going to say, give it to the homeless woman. You know, give her a house. But if you don't have these options available, if you don't start bringing on more housing online, then you're not going to have a position for these people to live in.
I agree. It's a problem of supply and demand, right? And we can increase we increase housing affordability by increasing supply, which is one of the big things that we need. Is we need a systemic and structural planning reform to make it easier to build, right? But I think one of the core arguments that we like to make is, yeah, sure, if you're going to be investing in brownfield sites to make them viable, it's just sometimes frustrating to see that when we've got projects on the table that have been sitting on the shelf that we really want to see developed, and we've been told no, or we have to scale back projects on brownfield sites because we also aren't looking to make that huge profit. We can build on some of these brownfield sites, and this is the same concern echoed by many, many local authorities, that if the goal at the end of the day is profit, then yes, that money is available. But if the goal is helping people, sometimes it isn't always. But obviously, from a local authority perspective, I'm thrilled to see these large developments happen in town, because that increases the amount of rateable income, that increases a penny rate product, that gives us more money to invest into parks, into recycling services, into bringing down rates for people, or holding those rates below the rate of inflation. So obviously, I think the construction industry is a partner, and you can't build your way out of the housing crisis without building.
Now we've touched on construction, we're going to go and have a little talk about the capital programme. Obviously a £90.2 million capital programme is within the budget. Brian, how do you feel about it?
Disappointed in some way. It's down from 22-23, was £182 million. We spent 113 of that. We've never spent the capital budget in all the years that I've been on the island. We've always tried to. So there is a concern that we are now going to be a much smaller sector. There is large projects coming up. They're not visible in the Pink Book, which is something that used to happen back in, I'll say, the good old days. 15 years ago, 10 years ago, you used to be able to see in the Pink Book what projects were coming out in the next 5 years. You could understand where the investment was going. You could then scale up your own business to get to a point where you realise it's okay, there's enough coming through the stream of work. There is a concern that's not visible. We can't see it. We don't know what's coming around the corner. There's very little in the PDF work for construction. And then the other problem, of course, is the use of off-island consultants and off-island contractors, which is going to diminish the Isle of Man's ability to continue construction.
Does the Minister want to respond?
No, it's that's the case. I mean, it was very easy to be a Treasury Minister in the 90s and the first part of the 2000s, because every year you could announce a new school, if you couldn't announce a new hospital, if you couldn't announce a new airport or a new harbour facility. It was very easy to be Treasury Minister because the money was pouring in, because we had it right in terms of the e-gaming and financial services, and the revenue was very plentiful. Now we're in the situation where the political challenge we've got is reducing the structural deficit and stopping eliminating the drawdown on reserves, because we have got less in real terms than we had those decades ago, and that's so. Therefore, We starting with this Treasury Minister with things like the major projects board. So the Chief Minister, when he was Treasury Minister, we launched things like the major projects board, and then we've operationalised that with the Project Development Fund. And I do think it's, I mean, you know that there's not that much in there, so it is transparent. I can't accept that it's not transparent. It's quite clear that we've got lots of projects in development, but we're not going to make the same mistakes that people started making when money was so plentiful. They can make mistakes. We can't afford to make mistakes now. We've got to manage the risks. We've got to optimise the use of the funds that we have inside our capital programme. We've got to manage the projects correctly. It might be that we're about to make mistakes in terms of using on-island and off-island contract frameworks. We've discussed this recently, and we won't be making the mistakes. In that we're having that dialogue. I talked about it today in the budget. I talked about construction and I talked about procurement in the context of construction. And we need to think local. I called it the theme of thinking local for the business sector. And so, I can't say today I'll magically find £100 million for a school here and a school there. But what we need to work together to make sure that we satisfy the need for new schools in Castletown, Douglas, Peel, and various other places around the island in terms of maintenance. We've got a link span that's 50 years old. We've got a radar. One of the radars we use is very, very old. You'd have to go a long way in the world to see one similar of the similar age. We've got all sorts of infrastructure requirements, and we've got to work with all of the stakeholders to make sure we do it best, for the island. And Douglas's experience is really good because it was very. You do have a visionary and an ambitious 10-year housing strategy. You haven't quite plucked up the courage as yet to make it completely public, but lots of people have seen it and you've shared it with me, and we've got to work together to enable you to do everything that you want to do, and that the private sector can contribute, because you do work with the private sector when you're delivering your schemes like Williston and Peel Road, and we are in it together. At the end of the day, you have equity on your balance sheet because you've been doing housing for 100 years for the public sector. The DOI hasn't been doing that. You have, and so therefore we need to actually work together with private sector, local authorities, not only for housing. You had the confidence and the courage as a council to engage Dandara for your civic amenity site, which you built, and it's a wonderful facility. There's all sorts of areas that we can work together inside the capital programme, and we've got to see this not from an ideological basis, from a practical basis. We need alternative ways of looking for capital, and your equity is very valuable.
I think given the constraints on the capital programme, I think what the business community is asking for is as much signposting as you can give us. Mm-hmm. So the businesses need to understand what is likely to happen so they can know when and what to invest in, what capital equipment, what apprenticeships. These are major decisions they're going to take on, which can take years to reap a return. And so as much information as you can give us, the better, to help maintain a strong and sustainable construction sector in the island and not leave us reliant upon permanently importing construction firms from elsewhere.
Yeah. And the other idea the Chief Minister had was this strategic infrastructure needs assessment, which Dr. Allinson took forward. It didn't work out quite as quickly as it should have done, and we're still not happy with the results, but we've got to move that into a national infrastructure strategy to give you that clarity.
Yes. I think the points Chris has made are important. I think we are moving into perhaps a different phase of looking at capital investment, capital infrastructure, how we do it. Absolutely, there is huge importance in terms of government adhering to its budgets, meeting the plans that we're setting out, because right now overexpending, not meeting our commitments is going to be of significant cost to us. We've had plenty of warnings about the use of reserves. I think it is mapped out that we have got a better course in front of us, providing we stay to that course. But I think also, the idea that we find new ways to invest in capital and infrastructure is important as well. I think, Chris, that point you make is, I don't think that this is just going to be a simplistic answer anymore. I think we do need to work together. There will be cases and causes, I think, in the future where actually we need to perhaps look at some of the investments differently, and I particularly housing investments. Yes, we've seen the IIS, and I think actually Brian, I did think that from a government perspective in terms of investment, it has been very much a sort of pillar of success. I know it's got its critics, but it has attracted £80 million of investment. But I also accept the point you make that actually, well, that's fine, well and good, but now, where is that sort of sight that we can see over the next few years? And I think the Treasury Minister is trying to define things more carefully and closely, but I think the points you make are also valid. But it's just the other point I wanted to make to Devon, but also generally around the housing. I think we do need to try and be innovative. I am a bit disappointed we never got to create the housing association I wanted, but more to the point, I guess the sphere where actually we tried to work a bit more innovatively to try and self-fund, both for sort of the absolutely critical housing that you were talking about for those really severe cases, homelessness, etc., to the more defined need that we can see in our communities, and working out ways to help support the investment. So it's not just all on the taxpayer 100% of the time, i.e. we're trying to find ways that we can also provide for sort of other types of housing that perhaps can be sold on and then help fund that sort of social housing element. And in fact, I think you have had a sort of stab at that, haven't you, with Lord Street perhaps?
We're very, very keen. So one of the things we're really excited about with regards to this is that we are going to become one of the local authorities that projected over the next decade or so that we will eventually be weaning ourselves off a lot of that social, that taxpayer support, because social housing is something that can theoretically be completely self-funding. There's no reason why it can't be, whilst still also remaining affordable at the same time. But I think what we need in order to get to that point is that level of investment and that capacity to allow local authorities to experiment with things like mid-rent, to have a bit more control over how we handle some of our loans, a bit more autonomy in how we handle our own maintenance processes. And if we can do that, I think we can build the hundreds of homes that are required. I mean,
and there are working examples if we're prepared to be brave enough as well, where we can see some of this investment working in the way that has been outlined. But and I think it does require all the parties to work together. I think partly to have an open mind as well in terms of looking at new ways to fund things. But driving back, Brian, to your original point, I think it's fair enough in terms of, I think the skills bit is the critical element, because as you say, if there isn't a couple of 2 or 3, 4 years sight at least in terms of something coming down the road, then that investment from the private sector in that skills base and that concern from industry in terms of the investment they need to perhaps maintain that business to that point could come under threat. And I think it's something I hope will be taken on board as we move forward.
One of the things you did say is you need to be careful of overspending. The bigger issue we have is actually underspend on the capital budget, because historically that's what we do, we underspend. And the delivery of those schemes, if you're going to put it in, deliver it. Now I know there's things outside your ability that cause problems and delays, but generally if there is something within the capital budget, it has to be delivered. You have to be able to give the confidence to the construction sector that you are going to deliver those schemes. And they are going to be. That's a really valuable point. That's why I wouldn't commit today that whatever the cost of a particular school, I wasn't going to guarantee it was on the June thing. We've got to work with you guys to make sure we know the cost and what the risks are and what sort of optimism bias there is in it. But what's really excited me about this conversation so far is Devon mentioning mid-rent. What that means is people who tenants pay a higher rent. They pay closer to the market rent. It's still a reduced rent. It's called mid-rent. Devon used that word. That's the source of capital effectively, because it's reducing our need for the housing deficiency fund. And there's a couple of other things that I'm sure that Douglas and others would help us with for new sources of capital for construction of what we need, which is housing. And for instance, rent to buy. If you can get people to finance their own properties that they'll eventually own through renting them for a while. And I know Minister Ashford has talked about making a definitive decision on rent to buy. And I know the Chief Minister and I, when we first had this concept of a housing association, the basic point is if we can be efficient about financing, housing is profitable, as Devon will say to you, in the sense that not only does it change lives, it also pays for itself. And so therefore we can find a way of mobilising institutional capital for housing if we do it right, using people who've got equity to help us borrow money, with the risk shared with other people who can take on that risk, because government can't do everything.
Now, in a minute, the Chief Minister is going to leave us and we're going to have the Health Minister come in and we're going to talk about health. But before we do that, I just want to ask one question, that with this budget, could it be argued that Treasury are leaving major issues and costly capital projects for the next government?
Well, I'll leave the Treasury Minister to answer that. But, I think as I set out, I actually think the budget does present a clear pathway through to 2030, does give a source of encouragement in terms of returning money back to the reserves, does reduce our reliance on those reserves, and the structural deficit comes down. I think the conversation so far has really highlighted some of the other areas that we need to work on. But I do think that the budget is clear. It has been tricky. I know it was a difficult debate today in many areas, but for me anyway, this was the budget that was needed for the year ahead, and for in terms of setting out the pathways to come. So, I think the Treasury Minister has been very transparent actually in terms of what he has said today, but also what has gone into the budget. And that's why I say absolutely. I mean, there could be changes, but the platform for the next government is laid out. And I think we go back, I mean, all the sort of hullabaloo, if you like, has really been around this personal allowance increase. But, as we started out with this conversation, I absolutely maintain we had to change direction. And if we hadn't have changed direction, I think the economy would have had an incredibly difficult 12 months ahead of it. And I think that we need to perhaps take one or two lessons as to what is happening elsewhere around us. If you pursue this sort of critical issue of raising business costs to a point where actually business just can no longer remain competitive, and we were in serious danger of reaching that point. So I think the budget is a fair budget. It's the right budget for today. I'm sure there's lots of hot areas where we can pick issues with it, but I think the Treasury Minister's been hugely transparent, and I think we've got the platform for the future.
Treasury Minister, would you like to add anything?
We currently can't fund everything that we need, so therefore we've got to optimise the funding of everything we need and work out a way of doing it. And so that's where we are. You've heard that from the construction sector, from the Chamber of Commerce, from Devon, from the Labour Party. So therefore, I'll give you some examples. We've set out an ambition to begin replacing our late 20th century vessels. That costs money. We've got to find a way of financing that. We used £80 million from our 400 million bond for the first vessel, and there is a public consultation from the steam packet about what sort of vessel they want for the replacement of the fast craft and how to finance it. In terms of energy, the Pink Book is completely transparent that we haven't as yet made decisions. One of the issues is we can't make decisions until we know the costs. It's a bit like construction. We're like that with energy. We've got big gaps on energy. So it is completely, your question is correct. I can't say this is exactly what we're going to do for the next 10 years. I do think we need to be in that situation. We've made a lot of progress, and that's why I'm delighted to join the government, because they have set up the basics of a major project board, priority-based budgeting, understanding that they're constrained on capital. The structural deficit and the reserves do constrain us, and so therefore now we need to do the next part of the picture, which I want to contribute to, and even in the next few months, to actually set down clearly what the infrastructure needs are and to give people options for how they can be financed.
The economy is very challenging right now, so that this budget put the economy front and centre is absolutely crucial. But again, each administration flows to the next, and the next administration has to make the economy the number one priority. The Isle of Man has been at its best, not when we're looking inward, obsessing about local matters, but when we work outward. When we created a banking sector from nothing, we created a life insurance sector from nothing, we created an e-gaming industry from nothing, not by gazing inward at internal concerns, but spotting economic opportunities on the world stage and working together to achieve those. We now need to do that again. We now need to reinvigorate our economy. We've lost sight of that at times, and we now need to reinvigorate our economy. So the number one issue for the election, by far, is the economy. Everything else falls into a secondary category.
Perfect, thank you very much. Chief Minister, we'll let you go.
Thank you
and
very
we'll
much.
take a short break and be joined with the Health Minister, Claire Christian, shortly. Welcome back to Manx.News' budget analysis. We're now joined by the Health Minister, Claire Christian. So, Claire, obviously Manx Care is getting quite a lot of money this year, and we're hoping to not see an overspend. What safeguards can you really give that that's not going to happen?
Thank you, Charlie, for inviting me here today. I think that's obviously one of the main points that the Manx public really want to hear, is that assurance from myself, from the Treasury Minister, and what we're going to be doing to ensure that the budget is the budget after all. The way that we have approached this year is going forward is there are a couple of areas. So we're looking obviously at the financial recovery programme, which we have implemented, and we've started that through the transformation programme. This is going to look at 30 million in terms of cost improvement over the next 3 years. So those are efficiencies, and that's including the 6 million that we've identified in this year. We are also going to be looking at stronger financial controls. And I think that that's not to say that there haven't been stronger financial controls, but we certainly in the year since I've been Minister, it's really getting I guess lifting the hood for me. It's definitely about getting more involved, and that's been allowed because of the governance review, because we're working on that as well at the same time, where we've identified that we really need to, instead of this being the typical arm's length company, which or business or organisation, which it should be, and it will get to that, like it is in the police force or like it is in the fire service, which has had many years of being arm's length. We actually need to help them to be able to deliver that. And the reason I say that is because over the years, Mr. Thomas has heard me say we actually, as parliamentarians, we have a fiscal responsibility as well. So when we're adding strategies or we're adding different types of care or etc., we're bringing even motions in Parliament, we've got a fiscal responsibility to know what that impact it has on certain areas. And I know there have been a great deal, for example, the carers strategy, where this budget has now allowed us to invest in the carers strategy, which is really, really fundamentally really good. Whereas before, we were trying to do that and to try and provide those services, and not within our means. We didn't have that budget at that time. So it is really important. Stronger relationships with Treasury, with Manx Care, and with obviously the DHSC having oversight over that. And I think that that's where we get this assurance, financial recovery programme and stronger accountability.
And we've spoken about efficiencies, and we would like public services to be really well delivered and to be on time and to get doctors' appointments. For the people that may see this budget and see an extra 45 million to healthcare, will they see an improvement in their public service with health?
Yes, so since being Minister, I've really concentrated on things that really people can see on in terms of what affect them, and I think that just comes down from the kind of politician that I am, that I like to be able to say these are the 5 key priorities. So, for example, we looked at obviously reducing the dentist waiting lists. That was fundamental investment to pair the dental the EDUs, I can't get the right short reference there, to pay them the fair amount of money that they were being paid in the UK, so that we could increase the amount of dental appointments, so that we could reduce the waiting list. This budget is also looking at 10,000 new in person-to-person and virtual GP appointments. Again, what that does, and I've explained this in previous interviews where I've said, we've got to solve the problem at the start, the GP, because if we don't put investment in there, people are not going to get to see a GP, and eventually they end up in acute care in the hospital, which is far more expensive. So we have to shift that over to primary care. Also, we've invested in pharmacies so people can get more prescriptions, different types of services within pharmacies as well. Again, that helps the other end in terms of the hospital care, because we're getting to the right care at the right time when people actually need it.
And Treasury Minister, how confident are you that that £45 million will stop any further I suppose, asked for handouts, really, putting it bluntly.
So for the last, well, since the Manx Care was created, the annual increase has been more than 10% a year, and they haven't, and they have still have had overspends. That's got to stop, because the Chief Minister gave those figures. That would mean we were spending £650 million in the next 5 years on healthcare, which is a absolutely huge number, given that we used to only be spending close to £200 million on healthcare. So therefore, we've hardened the constraint. One of the ways we've done that is to put the contingency reserve directly by year, for 1 year only, draw down from reserves, so we know what we're doing and the public know what we're doing if we finance an overspend. Look, as I confirmed with Mr Hooper today when he raised the point, management accounts already indicate that there has been too much money spent this last year. We're talking about this coming year. We're talking about the constraints. I promised we would come back to Tynwald to deal with the too much money that's been spent in the last year. But we're doing the Department of Health and Social Care, Manx Care, the transformation team, this financial recovery programme. It's quite obvious that they're really focused on dealing with the issues, and we're supporting them in Treasury. We have quite profound rows. I mean, in my first week, I was worrying about the budget to an extent, but Minister wasn't letting me entirely, because she had a very important issue to deal with in terms of non-emergency patient transfer and the transformation fund. Quite right, because she wanted to nail things down. Even this morning, we were still talking about exactly how we're going to deal with certain things, and there's been lots going on. The budget's been a tiny part of my job, in actual fact, if I was to be honest, and that's good, because it shows that we're working together to try to control it. I want to bring in a third point to this, because Treasury would want me to say this, and I am the Treasury to speak for them in that sense. Manx Care Board has got to accept that in the private sector, if a board had allowed overspending for 4 years, they'd be worried about themselves. And so the board was created, and they've got to step up to the mark of understanding that a board can't overspend systematically without having consequences. And so that's why the governance debate that we've still got to come up in this Tynwald, and that's why the mandate and the operational performance debate that we've still got to have, if it's engineered by other people, is very important. Manx Care has got to take responsibility for itself. I've taken responsibility for the budget today in person. I know that's the sort of thing that you respect, and let's see Manx Care Board step up and do what they need to do, and let's see ourselves as a society put pressure on them to step up for the responsibilities.
And I think, if I might, just when we kind of talk about the practicalities, and we talk about lifting up the hood, as I mentioned before, it's not often talked about in the public domain that that how Manx Care is set up with internally. So they have a paper-based financial system, which you wouldn't believe, and we are on the cusp right now and of something quite exciting that we have never been able to do before, and that is to actually show what our demand is. And we've got the data now, we've managed to do that, and we're going to be able to present that over the next coming months, to be able to say this has been the demand over the last 4 years. Yeah. And we can actually say, instead of putting a sort of, it's going to increase 12% every year, and worry what the Treasury are sort of forecasting, we'll be able to say in different areas where we specifically see the demand is increasing, and then we can look at our capacity. And that's the really main point. So we can say, do we have enough capacity? Do we have enough budget for that area? And to be able to match that to the demand. And that is the first time that we are going to be able to do that. And then secondly, that the second part of that is working with public health, for example, working with experts, working with the Manx Care board as well, and saying what exactly is going to happen in 2, 3, 4, 5 years' time to our population. Where do you foresee? We can see where the trends are. We can see where we're thinking this is where we think we're going to have a great demand in tertiary care or certain specialities. But what we'll be able to do is try and predict then what the trends will be with our key stakeholders. And then we can start to come to Treasury and formulate this 3 to 5 year financial plan where we say this is how much we're going to need. And we can start to communicate to the public about that as well, and actually have honest conversations with them and say, actually, if we leave things where we are, we don't introduce any more services, we can afford this. Or if we introduce these more services and it increases in the way that we're now predicting and have the right data to do that, then actually what are we going to do to fund that? And how we start talking to the Manx public about that and having those honest conversations is going to be really key to the future of sustaining our healthcare.
And do you believe with that new system that Manx Care will be able to be then properly held to account, really, for where their money's going to go?
Absolutely, because at the moment we don't know where, we're relying on them to say these are the drivers, but being absolutely to be able to see that data behind that also helps us to be able to go to Treasury and say, here's the data, that we've got evidence that this is where it's growing, but we've also got the evidence to say where it isn't growing. And that's the real key thing, because then we can say and use those levers to be able to kind of shift the budget where we need to shift it.
Just to support.
I just want to challenge the paradigm that I think sometimes that we sort of enter into when we talk about healthcare, which is one about how can we cut, how can we reduce, how can we hold down costs? Because I think that this can be quite a damaging paradigm. I mean, my own mother was almost killed via a medical error that was caused by the fact that the people who administer the healthcare are stressed and have to work these insane shifts. And I think it's one of those things where we don't see the limit of just saying, okay, no more funding at this point, but it's when someone's own family member is sort of the one who is at that price point and is at that point where that price point gets sacrificed, then you end up having those concerns, because Manx healthcare spending per person isn't insane. I mean, when you compare us to the French, the Danish, the Dutch, the Belgians, the Germans, the Norwegians, who have, yes, they've got a higher contributions toward healthcare, but then they have healthcare that they know works. I don't want us to move into a situation where we benchmark our expectations based on the United Kingdom, where you can't get seen for absolutely critical things and then people die as a result. Yeah. I mean, I think it's one of those things where to some extent we have to bite the bullet and accept that we've got an aging population, and a part of having an aging population means that you have to invest that funds. And unless we're going to be investing in big programs that changes that demographic balance in the Isle of Man and brings a lot more young people over, unless we deal with housing, unless we deal with the fact that people have cripplingly low wages, unless we deal with the fact that people have very few opportunities, then you aren't going to shift that. I mean, often healthcare is the thing that is at the end point and accumulates all of the other failures within our system. If you're living in a mouldy flat, then that ends up being the thing that impacts on the NHS. If you're deprived or suffer abuse, you're a lot more likely to have like mental health issues. So I think that rather than it being that Manx Care specifically is not acting as it ought to, maybe that there are scope for efficiencies, but we really need to have like a whole system approach to how do we build a healthy society here. And that's one of the things I just get a bit concerned on when we say, okay, how do we reduce rather than how do we improve?
I think the concern is it's about the cost and the quality. Almost everybody I know has got a personal anecdote from themselves or a member of their family where there's been a substantial administrative error or medical error. Some stories quite shocking. I know of almost no one who would say they feel that the quality of medical care is improving. Yeah. And the cost seems to go up and up and up. And inevitably we're relying upon anecdotes because, as the Minister rightly said, there's been a paucity of honest, open, transparent data. And medical care is getting ever more complex, ever more specialist, and most of us are just not skilled to be able to analyse how efficient is Manx Care. I would suggest nobody in Treasury has the skills necessary to understand how efficient or effective Manx Care is. We need independent experts, people from the likes of the King's Fund, genuine internationally recognised experts who can review our data, say, yes, you're gathering the appropriate data sets and how you benchmark internationally. So you can state how good is the quality and how good is the value for money. Because I honestly don't believe we know that now.
I think you're
and
right.
That deeply concerns me.
I think just picking back onto upon Devon's points in the sense of who we benchmark it against, you know, it really sort of rang home to me just a couple of weeks ago when Wes Streeting was announcing, I think it was £10 million worth more investment for children in the UK to paid transport to their care. And I hadn't really thought, even though I have had lived in the UK for some time prior to moving back to the island, but every citizen in the UK has to travel, if they're living in Timbuktu, has to travel, pay for it themselves, get up at 2 in the morning, 4 in the morning, whatever, to get that 4-hour train journey to have that cancer care, and they're investing in that. And it's only that you then look at us. We don't have a lot of that cancer treatment here on the island, so we do have to send our Manx citizens to the UK, and it is a given that it's paid for, and it may not, and I know it's early hours, because I know that I've actually travelled with some patients because to see it for myself and how hard it is. So I know that that's hard, but it's automatically, so like for like, it's a very different service, because in the UK, if you're going for cancer treatment as an adult now and prior, as a child, parents would have had to pay for that travel, and they were talking averages like £250 at each time. So it is very different, and I think that you're right to say that there are obviously other jurisdictions that obviously contribute more in terms of tax and NI towards healthcare. I think just picking up on your point, yeah, you're absolutely right in saying that being able to say that this data and analyse it properly, it is going to be really, really key. It's so important, and I cannot say how, to the person on the street, why is data important? And I think it's because being open and transparent and being able to explain why our costs have gone up or are going up or are going down is really, really important to the public. This has got more important in today's society than ever before, because headlines are just short little brief statements, and it doesn't really give us the context. You mentioned context before. So that's why we need to treat the public with respect and try and get this information for them to be able to understand what position we're in. It's easy for me to say, so we look at the budget in 2021 was £270 million, and the budget today is £404 million. It's a £135 million increase over these years. So it's around about 49.6% increase. So I started over the last couple of weeks, because I know the impact that the public are going to say, this is a lot of money. Why has it increased so much? So we're asking the questions. Okay, inflation compounded is probably about 32%. But on top of that, the amount of services that we've added, it's huge. These are the reasons why. And so actually, when we start to put that in and start to say, year on year on year, this has increased because of our decisions, and because we, not just our decisions, there's been different decisions in terms of the quality you talked about, Care and Quality Commission, Ofsted reports. We've had deanery reports where they say, you need to be safe, and you need to have this many people on the ward to make that safe. So we've had to increase our areas and increase our workforce to meet those standards to be safe. And those are pressures, and it's really hard to quantify. It's hard for me to kind of come in, not from the beginning, but in a year to try and quantify that and trying to gather all that information, because it isn't there. It isn't easy to get hold of. But I am hoping that we can communicate a lot better to the public about these things.
And I'd like to just move away from health and go to the Treasury Minister. Now, we're going to talk on the reserves briefly, but I don't think it'll be very brief given the two faces over there. Whether we like it or not, you have really inherited a Treasury that has been relying on reserves, and you've come out and said very similar, in a different sort of tone to what we've heard before, that we must stop relying on reserves. How are we actually going to do that?
So the amount of reserves we've got is greater than it was recently. So although I today I took the blame for having overly frightened my colleagues, because they were all obsessed with the fact that the reserves were just vanishing. The reality was I wanted to make them think that we couldn't go just saying we were coming back to finance a school, whatever it cost, and so on and so on. So I actually focused on the worst possible presentation of the reserve fund by excluding the national insurance and excluding investment returns and taking into account inflation. So later on, Mr. Ashford worked with Mr. Ashford to actually make sure that we actually put the accurate picture, which we have got we have got reserves that Moody's have given us a very good rating for, and enable us to borrow money, which we can add to our reserves with borrowing more if we want to, at a very cheap rate, at a very tight spread to UK gilts. So how are we going to make people stop using the reserves? Basically, we've got to start funding capital expenditure from revenue, which is what we started to do, and we've got to make sure that the reserve use is constrained, and that we have more income coming in each year than we have expending going out. It might be that we dream about having a new type of the Isle of Man with capital gains tax and wealth tax, but I'll do everything I can to avoid that, and that's not the Isle of Man's history and tax tradition for hundreds of years. So therefore we have a tax policy that that relies on simplicity, being competitive, because we are living on the edge of the British Isles and the edge of Europe, with other expenses and costs involved. So we've got to have a sensible, simple tax policy. The purpose of tax is to finance the public services we need. It shouldn't really be for other socio-economic objectives, in my humble opinion, in the Isle of Man. And so therefore we've got to, in every area of expenditure, we've got to make sure that we can afford from the public purse, because we're spending other people's money, the service that we feel we need. So we've just got to be hard. The pictures, it's in a way it's quite good. I mean, what I could actually say was by 2028, 29, if you exclude the National Insurance Fund, we should, if we can persuade people to stick to the financial plan, have weaned people off using the reserves.
Now, Chris, Brian.
If I start by saying, aren't we in a fortunate position that we have reserves? Most governments in the world are deeply indebted.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So the Isle of Man is in a fortunate position. And Chamber of Commerce is keen to see that we stay that way. I think we need to be honest with ourselves. We have burnt a lot of reserves, and we haven't seen the pace and scale and urgency of government reform we would expect to see during that period. When we're burning reserves, we would expect to see government seriously attempting to reform, seriously making efficiency savings, reducing administrative costs, and we can't say that that's occurred. We can't say that urgency has been there. And we do desperately need to see it there. And the world is changing radically. Government services are catching up with the private sector and embracing technology, embracing digital transformation, embracing AI, and the Isle of Man government is falling further and further behind in that regard. And it can offer us better public services at lower costs and far better value, with far better data and far more insight, so we can make sure resources are targeted where they're most needed. So it is a win-win-win. But I'm not seeing any sense of urgency. Chamber is not seeing any sense of urgency in the civil service or within government to deliver that kind of change that's proportionate to our needs. So while we will wholeheartedly support all the economic measures, Chamber must say we do feel the pace and scale of government reform has to accelerate rapidly.
So, and why does the Chamber choose to blame the civil service rather than the politicians? Conceivably, there are civil servants who have been saying this for decades and are so frustrated that when anything significant comes forward, we end up with a motion in Tynwald to add new services or to resist any changes and so on. Yes. Why is it that the Chamber of Commerce has got the habit?
Please don't think that's the case. No, I think it is a combination of all.
Okay,
the leaders of the public sector.
And then the second point is we need to make sure that the public hear from the end of this that we're not burning reserves, in the sense that we started off with this amount and we've got this amount left. We haven't done that. We've still got this amount. It's still going up. It's less than it was 20 years ago in real terms, because inflation's been huge over those 20 years, and a greater and greater proportion of those reserves is for the National Insurance Fund, which is the bedrock of my pension, to Devon's pension, young people's pension as well, and of social security. So fewer and fewer, lower and lower proportion of the reserves are in the reserve fund. So we've got to be very careful, but we don't want to exaggerate the issue, because we also want to support the construction industry, turn around the local economy with targeted support. So look, Moody's said we've got a very good rating, and the reason Moody's say we've got a very good rating is because we have had economic success, and it looks like we'll continue to have economic success. We have got a low debt to national income ratio internationally. We do have that £2 billion worth of reserves. So that's all the good news. The bad news is we also now need to transform the system, and that's the most important thing I heard you said. And I do think these politicians agree with you, and I do think mostly Treasury civil servants completely agree with you. I mean, they were the boldest thing that we did today wasn't actually the personal tax allowance. It was just to say, and to get it accepted when we said it, that look, income's gone like that, healthcare expenditure's gone like that. That's the problem. So therefore, we need to concentrate on getting healthcare to be back at the same levels of growth as education and infrastructure, which has even gone down slightly in real terms. Yes. That's the issue.
Is that realistic? Because, for example, if your average person who's 80 requires 100 times more spending than someone who's 20, and the number of 80-year-olds doubles or triples over the next 10, 15 years, how do you hold down those cuts conceivably without cutting the level of service to those 80-year-olds or getting rid of services toward young people, right? And I think that's one of the things that we see overwhelmingly is when you look at this budget and where benefit spending is going, right? Yeah. The vast majority of it is services are being cut for folks who are younger. And what you're seeing is overwhelmingly the story of the Isle of Man of the past 20 years is that anything that is viewed as discretionary is ultimately anything that is spent on younger people. Arts programs, cultural programs, and these sort of things get cut down, which ends up helping contribute to this long-term problem of that demographic imbalance. So it's just one of those things where I think that to some extent we have to be careful of just not giving ourselves an impossible burden. Every healthcare system is struggling with demographics.
So I think to try and give you both hope in how are we going to, because yes, you're right, population needs are still going to increase, and you're right, if we don't sort of embrace technology fast enough. When I talked about that crystal ball effect, of us being able to see what we're going to need in the future, we're also having huge discussions within the department with our Manx Care board, with advisors in terms of how will the healthcare delivery change in the future, and that is through AI, and a lot of surgeries are now in the UK are changing in the sense that obviously AI or robotics are performing surgery. When you see certain investment in the UK, that obviously really does help us over here, because that means that we can tap into that investment, or we can invest in that ourselves. And there's going to be a certain period of time where we will be transitioning from requiring the UK to provide that for us, or do we look at buying one of those robotic AIs to perform the certain surgeries, such as cancer surgeries, keyhole surgeries, etc. And that is where that's really exciting. And yes, and we talk about, yes, what kind of efficiencies will that make? But obviously it will make financial efficiencies, but also it's really, really great for the patient as well, because these services really are improving. Yes. So we aren't, if that's some hope for you in terms of the encouragement to hear that, that we're not just sort of sitting in our old ways and expecting things to change or to be handed to us. We are looking at the wider perspective in terms of being able to develop. And those, again, are going to be conversations in 2 or 3 years' time to say, actually, medicine is going to have shifted great deal in a very different way, and we need to be able to have those conversations with Treasury to say we're going to need that investment in 2 years' time, or we're going to need it in 5 years' time. Yes. And we won't always look to Treasury. We also need to look to ourselves in terms of our own internal revenue stream, and we do have opportunities in the private patients in terms of private care as well, and that's something as part of the financial recovery programme that we're looking at as one of the streams that we'll be looking to try and bring in a revenue source. But we will always protect our NHS absolutely 100% first. That doesn't mean that replaces that means that will support that, because ultimately that we'd be stupid not to do that.
Yes.
And sorry,
just to emphasise, I know many dedicated public servants, very hard-working public servants, but when I talk to them, morale in government, I would say, is probably lower than it's ever been.
That's true.
And people feel there is no sense of direction at an officer level. and they want to be presented with an exciting and compelling and sustainable vision for public services. And instead what they feel is that it's death by 1,000 cuts.
Okay.
We're going to cut paper use in the printer this week, and we're going to cut window cleaning next. And thousands of little cuts that just lead to a depressing workplace environment, instead of saying how can we create an exciting vision of sustainable public services about the use of technology, which means we can do away with a lot of administration. And yes, that may mean some of those administrative jobs will go, but it means the money we targeted into better education, better health services, better things that the public value and are exciting for those workers to deliver.
I agree with you.
I think that's missing.
Change, what's really important when you're delivering change is bringing people along with you. It is fundamentally the only way you can do that. So within, since I've been minister, one of the really key things for me, and you talk about culture and you talk about, the morale and things like that. I'm not going to shy away from it. Morale in the DHSC, in Manx care, we've just had a barometer of care, but it's about taking that action, it's about listening. And one of the things that I'm really, really proactive, and that just comes from my background in the private industry, is the person who is the most accountable is me. Mistakes can happen, just tell me about them, because then I can hopefully help and change that. Or if I'm giving you too much work in terms of, because I have high expectations, I can imagine, but if I'm giving the department too much work, or my colleagues are giving you too much work in Parliament because they're adding this motion and this strategy and this, then we need to be able to say, actually, I want to deliver these 5 things really well, really, really well, and that is really important for us to do that. But bringing those people along with us and that change is really important, and bringing it back to health. The barometer of care survey, absolutely looking at that, making sure that we speak to our clinicians, making sure that they have a voice. That's again part of our governance structure that we're looking at, to bring that clinical voice up. And also bringing the DHSC down into this sort of new sphere where we're all communicating, and we'll take one decision and we'll feed it up through the chain and see who gets involved with it and how it works. It's really taking it and looking at that granular level, making the right people are at that point of that decision process and streamlining it.
Now, going back to reserves, I know that's fine.
I can swing it back to health anytime.
It's costing enough, so
It is.
it is. Brian.
The one concerning thing about the budget was there seems to be a kind of a move away from how we fund the capital programme, or how it has traditionally been funded, and the concern that you may start going down the lines of the bad situations that happened in the UK, PFI, that sort of problem. Just be very wary of that. You can build out of a slowdown in an economic slowdown, and that's what you should look to do, is build out of that economic slowdown. Don't go down the line with PFI. It doesn't work. It's proven in the UK it doesn't work. Please don't do it.
And I think we're nearly not far off wrapping up here, but my final question, I suppose, to the Treasury Minister would be, today in Tynwald we heard 2 very different sides. We heard the side of people saying the tax allowance will put more money in people's pockets, and we also heard the other side, that it's actually just costing people money, and they've now changed their mind and are not for giving more people money. Could you just give us your point of view on that, please?
Well, it's not a cost. Increasing a personal tax allowance is just reducing the income that comes to the public purse. In other words, not taking people out of money's pockets and putting it in the public purse. It's not a cost. It's a reduction in public tax take. But so that's the answer to that question. And what do you want me to say? Do I think the debate was structured around those lines? Yes, I do think it was. So I do think today I called it an unholy alliance. I think the people who voted against the budget today, half of them seemed to me to be very focused on just targeting the lower earners and focused on the median wage, and the other half seemed to be slash and burn right-wingers, and that's why I described it as an unholy alliance. And I talked about the Pope and communism. I mean, I do think there were two different reasons why people voted against the budget today. Some who have actually increased expenditure in various ways, or are beneficiaries of the public purse being spent in their roles as politicians, surprised me, because they have talked about reducing public expenditure and raising personal tax allowances and all that, but then they voted against the budget today when we're delivering these things. So to me, it's a pretty unstable group of an alliance between two halves. In two halves, seem to me to be four people who are basically honest, honourable, ideologically based people that government should exist to help those who need it most, and another half of the people who were somehow criticising me that I wasn't slashing and burning and tackling the reserves straight away and all of that. So I'm interested to see how this plays out now. So what I certainly think is, ultimately we can't afford to be ideological about this. We've got to be pragmatic, and that's why it's always a delight to meet people like Douglas City Council, to meet people like the Construction Forum, to meet people like the Chamber of Commerce, but also to meet the trade unions and the farmers and everybody else, because we need to work out ways to exist inside the Manx tradition of low taxes, because we've got relatively high costs here because of the travel. We have to focus on services and smaller value products. We just can't change economic realities, geographic realities. We can't become Monaco, because although I brought out the blue sky and the sunshine today with the budget, it is cold and windy out there as well in the Isle of Man quite regularly. We've got to deal with realities, and I hope the budget is helpful, because this is about stability and security of public finances, which provide stable and secure public services, and also stable and secure public revenue raising, which is also what's very important in the island.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Minister.
you very much for Manx.News inviting us in.
Thank you. Finally, does anyone have any short questions or concerns about the budget?
I
for
think
Minister before
I
we go?
just want to clarify from one of the halves of that unholy alliance as a member of the Manx Labour Party, and just sort of talking on behalf of, I think we've always going to be welcoming the rise in the tax thresholds, because it's great for people. I think our concern primarily comes for people who are on £14,000 a year, who walk away with nothing, and people on 90 grand a year who get another 500 quid, right? And it just feels as though that's sort of non-targeted when there are so many desperate needs. But largely, this budget had a lot of positives. We want to applaud a lot of the work that you guys have done. I mean, this is not something that I'm going to walk away and feel that this was a complete loss, right? This was fantastic, and I do want to applaud the work that Treasury's done to work with the local government and work with various members. But I think it's just one of those where the concern never was about raising thresholds. It's always about the targeting and making sure that the people who are unfortunately, as a result of these changes, worse off by a few £100 a year without the minimum wage increase, that they get the support they need, and just trying to reassure people that they get that, because I'm not sure that that's always forthcoming. So as productive and non-ideological as possible.
Thank you. The fact you've raised the tax thresholds takes those people, gives those people a bit more money in their pocket, gives everybody a bit more money in their pocket. All that money goes around the economy, and as long as it stays in the economy, it goes around the economy. You'll get it back. Chris will get it back. We won't, but Chris will get it back. And that's what you need to keep doing. We need to keep the money on the island, the spend on the island as much as we possibly can.
From Chamber's perspective, it's a budget that definitely helps the economy in the short term, which is much needed. In the longer term, we need to work with government, as I said earlier, on where's the growth going to come from in the future. Financial services and e-gaming and related industries have been the bedrock of our success for the last 50 years and will be for at least the next 50. We need to come up with targeted growth campaigns jointly and deliver on those. And that needs to be the number one priority going forward.
Perfect. Thank you very much, everyone, for giving your Tuesday evening and coming and sitting and talking politics and budgets. I'm sure you have much more exciting things to do.
Thank you very much, Charlie.
But that's all from us for our Manx.News budget analysis. You can read more about today's budget and all the debate and goings on within Tynwald on Manx.News. Thank you.